Okay, the last section in part 7 of our chapter, we're going to kind of combine a couple of them. We're going to talk about differences in intellectual development, um, creativity, and determinants all in the same um, video here, since they're all kind of short, so there's really no need to kind of do one for each. So let's take a look at differences in intellectual development and why some of those things might happen. One of the differences that can happen is our intellectual disabilities. Now, these are characterized by limitations in intellectual functioning and also behavior. When we look at conceptual ideas, when we look at practical kind of living skills, and when we look at social skills. Now, usually this originates before the age of 18. Many times involves an IQ score of more than 70 to 75. And remember, the average IQ scores range from about 85 to 115, 90 to 110, somewhere in there. So nearly 95% of everyone gets an IQ score of 70 to 130. So we're really looking at a very lower end of the spectrum here when it comes to intellectual disability. Now, 80% of these children are typically mildly disabled. They're usually capable of adjusting to demands of, their regular academic settings. Many of these children are mainstreamed into regular classrooms. Now, another disability that can hamper intellectual development is Down syndrome. Now, Down syndrome kids are more likely to be intellectually disabled. Very quite able, I should say, to learn skills that we all learn: speaking, dressing, feeding themselves, holding down a job. I've seen Down syndrome folks get married, that sort of thing, have very, very normal lives. Now, remember, Down syndrome is a genetic mutation. It's a genetic disorder. And so it isn't something that can be changed. It's just something that that the Down syndrome child needs to learn within their capabilities. And then another intellectual developmental disability that can happen is what's called cultural familial disability. And this is where a child is not performing up to their intellectual capabilities because they're not given opportunities. They're not exposed educationally. They come from an impoverished home environment. So they're not developing age-appropriate behaviors because they aren't being exposed to the different kinds of skills and being able to learn the different kinds of skills they should be developing at an age-appropriate level. So many times you will see these kids have, not interacting with adults, not have a lot of toys to play with. However, many of these kids, if interventions happen early enough and at the correct time, the cultural familial disability can be turned around. Now, other differences involve giftedness. Now, giftedness is just more than having a high IQ. There are outstanding abilities in other areas. Things like language, things like math, and high giftedness in an academic area like writing, but also things like showing creativity, showing leadership, having a high level in the performing arts or bodily talents like swimming, gymnastics, dancing, things like that. So giftedness can express its ways in lots of different ways. And then another difference we can find are between SES statuses and ethnic differences. Now, we do know that children from lower socioeconomic statuses, SES, typically obtain lower IQ scores, 10 to 15 lower than average obtained by middle and upper class children. We know that kids from certain ethnic groups tend to score below the norms. We know that kids of other Asian groups tend to outperform other ethnic groups. So why is this? Well, psychologists typically think are of the mind that it's not due to actual racial genetic um, inherent differences. It has to do with exposure to educational environments, exposure to academic settings, exposure to cognitive skills, kind of developing those skills, and then also different attitudes towards education, different attitudes where priorities should lie, and what's important in the home life, and what is able to be a priority in the home life. So these ethnic differences really don't seem to actually exist more than on paper. There's lots of other reasons beyond ethnicity is why these differences happen. Now, part of intelligence is creativity, or we want to look at how they go together. Now, creativity is defined as flexibility, ingenuity, and originality, able to do things that are novel and useful. Now, creative children and adults usually do what's called think outside the box. They solve problems where there's no tried and true solution. They think of things in novel ways. Typically, they're more apt to take chances, uh, have more risky behavior, and typically appreciate art and music more than those who aren't labeled creative. And they are not afraid to challenge the social norms. Now, there's a whole debate whether creativity and IQ score or intelligence, depending on how you're talking about them, are related. If we look at actual IQ scores with creativity, there's a moderate relationship. But our IQ scores really depending on what they're measuring intelligence. Is there a different kind of intelligence that might be related to creativity? Well, let's look at this. Convergent thinking. All right, convergent thinking is the kind of thought process that we use when we're answering typical questions. And typical questions are what's found on an IQ test. There is typically one solution to the problem. There's a single best solution, a single best answer, and that's convergent thinking. Now, creativity often requires divergent thinking. Free association, fluent association, of fluidity between the elements of the problem, but there might be more than one way to look at the problem, more than one way to skin a cat, as the saying goes, more than one solution, more than one way to get to the solution. It often requires more creativity. So when we're looking at intelligence and how we typically measure intelligence, we're looking at convergent thinking. How well is someone able to do that? And then apply what they know. When we're looking at creativity, we're trying to tap into divergent thinking. So when we're trying to see the relationship between convergent thinking and divergent thinking, we're really trying to see how are apples and oranges related, right? They're both fruit, but comparing them is very difficult because they're very different. And the same with convergent and divergent thinking. Now, when we look at determinants of intellectual development, we cannot fail to look at things like heritability and our genetics. How does that influence our intelligence or intellectual development? Well, twin studies and family studies, longitudinal studies are a great way to kind of look at the potential genetic component, the inherited component of intelligence. If you look at the table here, and a version of this is in your book, and we look at familial relationships, we can see how related family relationships are to IQ scores. Now remember, when we're talking correlation, and that's on the left-hand side here, that is just the degree of relationship between the two variables. So the degree of relationship between our genetic relationship, how close we are to someone genetically, and the IQ score, higher or lower. What we see is monozygotic twins. Okay, and we look at all the way to the far right, monozygotic or identical twins who are raised together. Their IQs tend to relate to one another at a 0.85 level. So not a perfect one-to-one, right? But highly related. A 0.85 correlation is really high, which basically means if one twin has a high IQ, the other one's going to have a high IQ. One twin has a medium IQ, the other one's going to have a medium IQ. If one twin has a low IQ, the other one's probably going to have a lower IQ. So it's not a perfect one-to-one relationship, but there is a strong relationship. If we look at identical twins reared apart, there's still a better than half correlation, but the correlation isn't nearly as strong. It's 20 points less. So it does appear that there still seems to be some genetic component. These identical twins still share 100% of their genetic information. So they start with the same abilities, or at least the same probability of developing intelligence. But they're reared apart. So the influence of nurture, the influence of their environment shows us that the environment and how we're raised and what we're exposed to does have an impact on our development of our IQ, our intelligence. If we look at, let's see, fraternal twin raised together, so siblings that are no more genetically the same than regular brother and sister, we see that that's also kind of high, 0.6. Siblings reared together, so biological brothers and sisters that are reared together is still 0.4. Or still, I should say, closer to 0.5. So it looks like the heritability, the percentage of what we get from our parents and what is genetically based in terms of intelligence is around 40 to 60%. The rest might be due to environment. We know environmental stimulation increases IQ, whether a child is adopted, biological, or has low socioeconomic status.